And good evening, everybody. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Dr. Ulrike Altenmüller-Lewis. I'm the Department Head for Architecture, Design, and Urbanism at the Antoinette Westphal College of Media Arts and Design, and I welcome you. We've been relocated to this unusual space. We're usually at Mandel, but tonight we're here at Mitchell Auditorium. I'm glad that all of you at least found us. And this is the last of our annual lecture series, the Arfaa lecture series, and can you believe it? It's the 31st year. Our speakers this year represented a very wide variety of approaches to design and design research. Last October, we heard a lecture by Henry Escobar on the impact of parking in our cities. In January, Jae Yong-suk introduced us to his research on light for health and the environment. And today, we will host Vishaan Chakrabarti, founder of Practice of Architecture and Urbanism, or abbreviated POW. Vishaan is here with his team to work with our students on the interdisciplinary, and this went out again, I think. No, I need to have both lights on. What did you do earlier? Let's see, I hope you don't have to do that every 2 minutes, Vishaan. That's the additional challenge. Okay. I admit I'm technologically challenged, but we will get through this. At least I hear when I can't hear myself, or you won't hear myself. So Vishaan and his team, they're here this weekend to work with our students on the interdisciplinary design charrette throughout, starting tomorrow throughout Sunday. And you will hear a little bit more about that later. Naturally, we would like to thank the people who made our lecture series possible. And now I need to see, this is obviously not working the way my computer works. Wonderful. Tell you, I'm technologically challenged. Peter Arfaa, the former department head for architecture, and his wife Annie endowed this lecture series in honor of Peter's parents, Farah Shola and Mariam Bardi Arfaa, over 3 decades ago. While Peter Arfaa passed away a few years ago, we hope that this lecture series helps to keep him alive and his memory and his sharp intellect and his remarkable generosity. Before we can focus on tonight's lecture, I have a few more housekeeping items to do. That always falls to me, apparently. This lecture is going to be recorded, hence 2 microphones. I hope they both... At least I know what to do this time. Perhaps we can get one that does not switch itself off. Tim, can you actually tell the tech guy that it might be useful to have one that stays on? Anyhow, this part, now it's back on. Okay, so as always, you can earn 2 continuing education credits. They're granted for attending the lecture tonight for our licensed professionals. Please add your information to the forms that are at the entrance if you have not yet done so. Please also switch off your cell phones. And throughout the lecture, I would like to ask all of you to think about questions you might ask Vishaan later on. In the past, our freshmen were actually some of the people who've asked our best questions. So I give you a challenge. And while some of you do have class tonight, many of them starting at 6 or at 7, we ask that you stay with us until the Q&A is over. We've changed that protocol slightly. Okay, so what is a charrette? A design charrette is an intensive collaborative workshop that unites a diverse group of stakeholders, in our case, students from a wide range of disciplines, subject matter experts and professionals, to rapidly generate and develop solutions for a specific design or planning challenge. Here we go again, sorry. I hope we figure that out by the time the actual act starts. The department... Oh. The Department of Architecture, Design and Urbanism has been hosting these biannual charrettes since 2007 with great success. This experience is often a highlight for our students. They learn from and with each other, sketch, dream, and generate ideas. Most importantly, they rethink overlooked spaces and have fun in the process. This year, our 2025 Drexel Student Design Charrette centers on Penn's Landing, a crucial link between the city of Philadelphia and the Delaware River. Charrettes are highly participatory and fast-paced. They typically involve brainstorming, sketching, and open discussions, enabling everyone to contribute ideas and feedback in real time. The charrette officially begins tomorrow afternoon. I hate this computer too. Makes this font where my notes are huge. Tell you, I'm technologically challenged. I get all of these glitches out of your way. The charrette officially begins tomorrow afternoon. 72 undergraduate and graduate students. Good, that would be so lovely. I'm going to insist that this part is being cut out of the recording. We have 72 undergraduate and graduate students, and they will take over the Urban Center alongside the POW team and supported by Drexel faculty and some alumni. The event kicks off with an introduction to the assignments and then a site exploration at Penn's Landing and the start of reimagining the land between I-95 and the Delaware waterfront. Faculty and alumni are still welcome to volunteer as feedback providers on Saturday. So if you have time, please see Elisa and Tim. The grand finale will be the team's proposal presentations on Sunday, May 4th in the Urban Center lobby, beginning with opening remarks at 1 p.m. So a huge thank you to all of our sponsors who are making this event possible. We would not have been able to do it without your generous support. We got funding from the Rankin Scholars in Residence program, the Antoinette Westphal College of Media Arts and Design, and from Fed Vico Architects. My particular thanks go to the Charrette Planning Committee or team. I think there might be a hidden camera somewhere, just seeing how I do with these kind of interruptions. My particular thanks goes to our Charrette Planning Committee and everyone who supported them. Mark Willey, who created all of the graphics, Andrew Sitzer, who brought the experience from previous charrettes to the table, Diana Marshall, Devin Jackson, and Rachel Penny for all their behind-the-scenes work for the charrette. They helped incredibly with the logistics. Tim Navrocki and Elisa Rubendahl, the co-chairs of this charrette, are really our superheroes. They have invested an enormous amount of time and energy, and they deserve a special round of applause. But I've taken up too much of your time already. I hope that the microphone stays on for Jason Schupach. Otherwise, I can show you which buttons to push, Jason. So I would like to welcome Jason Schupach, the Dean of the Antoinette Westphal College of Media Arts and Design.
I'm loud, so we have nothing to worry about. Hi everybody. Okay, it's 6 o'clock, you're tired. Hi everybody, try that again. I'm just gonna give you a free brief remarks about my friend Vishaan Chakrabarti. Besides having a really cool firm name, POW, not a single laugh, awesome, okay. He has had a really incredible career. It's spanned, besides being a principal at SHOP and the director of the Manhattan office of the New York Department of City Planning, and he has also been the president of the Moynihan Station Venture at related companies and a dean at the College of Environmental Design at Berkeley. And there's a bunch of other stuff to say about him here, but I'm not going to do that because he asked me not to. But he is one of the world's leading thinkers about cities. It is such an honor to be in his presence. He has worked with so many leaders across the world about how to build great cities, how to design great cities for the people that live in them in an environmentally responsible way. He's a genius, and I don't say that lightly. He knows how snobby I am, so I'm just kidding. And so we're just so honored to have you. Thanks for coming down, and I'm so thrilled you're going to be able to be with our students for so many days. And I'm not going to take the stage any longer so that you can hear from this incredible person. Please give a huge Westfall welcome to Vishaan.
Thank you, Jason. That was very, very kind of you. Thank you, everyone, for having me. Thank you for inviting me. I'm so looking forward to the charrette. I know it's late for a lot of you guys. I know you have classes. I'm going to try to be lively. If the mic goes out, I'm just going to keep talking through it. Okay. I've never given this lecture before because your organizer said, do something different. And I really wanted to address the students with this lecture. And the question I mainly get from students is how did it all happen? I turned 60 this year, and by the time someone gets to a stage like this, it might even look like it was easy or look like it all just fell into place. And so I think it's good to sort of go back, and it was good for me to go back and kind of do a little soul searching about how to talk about one's own past. I don't do that often. There's three aspects to the airline that I think got me here in front of you today. To me, this is the most critical invention of modernity. The 747, one of the most beautiful things human beings have ever invented, that connected a lot of immigrants to this country, especially in the 1960s. My parents and my sister and I came in a plane that looked very much like this, in a company called Pan Am that no longer exists. From India, we moved to Tucson, Arizona with $32 in 1968. You may notice that the POW logo looks a little bit like the Pan Am logo. That's not a coincidence. My parents, and especially my dad was a scientist, my mother was a singer, and they really loved to travel. We traveled on a shoestring budget, and so all through my childhood, we spent a lot of time in budget hotels, crazy trains, crazy planes. And I think that's where I got my love of cities and my love of architecture. And then the third thing is, in terms of planes, unfortunately, is my first job out of college was in these buildings. And I love New York. Horrible things happened. But it set a trajectory because I think I thought about the city, its vulnerabilities, how it gets built in a fundamentally different way. I practiced architecture. I studied urban planning and architecture. I practiced architecture. I got my license. But when 9/11 happened, I felt a call to public service. I went to work for the Bloomberg administration, became Manhattan planning director. I was wholly underqualified for that job, but somehow I got it. And fought for a lot of things, fought for the reintegration of the street grid at the World Trade Center site. A group of 20 crazy people led by Robert Hammond and Josh David wanted to save this thing called the High Line. No one believed in it. It had 8.5 million visitors last year. And then went on, did various things, was a partner at SHOP, as was mentioned by Jason, worked on various things around the city, including Domino Park, which I'll talk about more in a minute. And I think this is the beginning of actually what is important in terms of something the students can learn, something maybe a little less personal. In 2009, I started writing for a blog called Urban Omnibus with the Architectural League. And by the time I had 10 blog entries, my editor there said, this is starting to feel like a book. And so over a couple of years, I wrote a book called The Country of Cities. Metropolis Books published it. It had a lot of graphics that we did while I was at SHOP. And it was really not so much a design book. It was a manifesto for how we live and to not take how we live for granted. That, you know, it's very important, especially for the students. When you look out in the world, it didn't always look like this, and it doesn't always have to look like this. You can't just take what's there for granted. So, you know, a lot of what this book was about the suburbs and climate change and issues with what we did in post-war America. That book, I think, was really important in terms of, it came out in 2013, and 2 years later, we formed POW. And so it became kind of the manifesto for POW. It became kind of our North Star for what the practice was going to be about. And so in the beginning, when I left shop, we didn't have, I think our son was 13 and helped me set up my website. And it just basically had these words on it. It didn't look as good. This pentagram has redesigned this. But it said basically the same thing. And this was the first moment where someone, like, people kind of noticed that something different was going on. Because if you go to most architecture websites, they'll talk about the work they do. They very rarely talk about the work that they don't do. And that's not because I expect everyone to have the same, you know, kind of position that we do in our office about what to do and what not to do. But I just written a book about how the suburbs are really harmful to the environment. I couldn't then start an architecture firm that started designing suburban homes and shopping malls and office parks. And so we felt it really important to say there's a certain set of things we want to do and a certain set of things that we don't want to do. And actually, it was, in many ways, the most important thing that happened in terms of the foundation of the practice. Because people who wanted to work for us and wanted to do these things came to us. People who wanted to hire us, who wanted to do these things, came to us. People who who were looking for an architect but wanted to build a prison or you know, a big spaceship built by slaves somewhere in Saudi Arabia, didn't call us, and that's great, right? Worked out perfectly. And so this was, and again, I've never done this lecture, so bear with me. I'm going to try to keep time. This was POW 1.0. That was our very first office was me and the gentleman sitting to my left, my assistant Brian, at our dining room table. But then within a few months, we got this office space, and there was like 8 or 9 of us. And we did start doing a lot of that kind of work that was on that list. And we did have some clients. It wasn't easy at all. But, you know, I feel that, like, so much of what the firm has been able to do has been built around having a voice. It started with that blog and then the book, and that then leads to invitations to come do things like this, right? Because if you have a voice, people sometimes want to know what you have to say. And also, I taught at Columbia for 13 years and then went on to Berkeley for a while. It's a long story. I was invited to give a TED Talk in 2017, which was one of the most terrifying things I've ever done in my life. And the office grew. And these things aren't a coincidence, right? The more we were out in the world, the more the office grew. So we moved one story up. We were suddenly about 18 people, and we were doing some really interesting work. People from all around the world, really great people came to our office. Very talented, very hardworking, mainly architects, but also people who are deeply, deeply dedicated to the idea, not just of cities, but larger scale communities. That launched into a second book that came out last year. That was a 7-year enterprise, different publisher, Princeton University Press. We did tons of diagrams for that book. This book is an argument with the first book. So one of the great things you get to do when you write it's harder than actually, or different, I should say, than when you're designing buildings or doing urban design work, is that, you know, never let anyone tell you that architecture is some solo enterprise. It involves an extraordinary number of people. Writing is much more of a solo enterprise. It's you, it's your publisher, it's you arguing with yourself at 3 a.m. And this book was an argument with my first book, because the first book kind of extolled the virtues of more communal living, whether in cities or just more compact, more dense circumstances, mass transit, less driving. But I realized that as people were building those kinds of places, that a lot of them were soulless, homogenous, and that design really mattered. And so it took on this idea of urbanity that I'm going to talk about in a second. And like this timeline that's at the bottom is a fold out in the book that talks about the fact that, you know, even post-pandemic, we're living it. You know, no one's just doing things remotely. We are all still gathering, doing this, right? And so it's just inherent, it's endemic to our species. Every part of the world, every continent, you find that since antiquity, people have been building communal civilization in different ways. And so the book really tries to dive into that. We are now at POW 3.0. We just moved into this office a few weeks ago. We already feel like we're running out of space. It's a great place. It's right across the street from the Empire State Building. It's a fun place to go to work every day, really good coffee machine. I continue to write. And so, you know, some architects, they paint or they sculpt. I write. And it's what keeps me sane. This online and in print publication called Vital City asked me to be a contributor. So I do about 4 or 5 articles for them a year. I do them when I want to. They're very kind to me about that. They pay me enough to take my wife and I out to a good dinner every once in a while. It's not for the money, believe me. But it is what keeps me sane in a lot of ways. And it also, again, keeps that active idea of having a voice in the world. That has spread not just to me, however. That is now the firm in many ways. And I think one of the most defining aspects of the office and what reputation we built in the world is a series of editorials we've been able to do with the op-ed page of the New York Times. The first one about Penn Station, which I'll talk about further, in 2016 when the firm was only 6 months old. That was about fixing Penn Station in New York. One that imagined a car light or car-free Manhattan in 2020, and then a recent one about housing that I'll also talk about. And again, this was, we did all the graphics for these. We did, for this housing one, I'll show you, we did an incredible amount of data analysis. The Times, well, I think for the first one, they paid us $150. The second one was like $250, and the third one was like $400, because that's like just what they give an op-ed contributor for writing a piece. So the fact that you're an architect and you've done all these drawings and all this research doesn't up your compensation. Look, I'm sorry to talk about money, but one of the things I feel like is really problematic in our profession is people don't talk about money enough. You guys are in school, you're gonna have student loans, you have to figure out how to pay these things off. It's really, really important that your life makes sense for you, right? And finances is part of that. And so people would say, my God, like you put all this money into those op-eds. It paid us back in spades, not in a literal way, but because it established who we are in the world. There's no way, there's no data that says because we did X, we got Y project. But it just gave awareness to people about who we are and what we believe in. And we've won a fair number of design awards in our 10 years, but this was, I think, one of the most interesting for me was when we won this from Fast Company, because it wasn't about the design work. It was about the culture of the studio and the idea of how we do the work. And I think that's incredibly important because you should never work for a place that abuses you. It's really, really important. So, just the fact that Fast Company would sort of go through and say, these guys don't have unpaid interns, they don't do any of that crap, but actually do something together with their staff, that's really important. So it's turned in, and I'll talk about a few of these projects, it's turned into this extraordinary range of work: air traffic control towers, adaptive reuse, urban planning, dorms, bridges. And people walk through our office and they say, I don't get it. I don't see a through line. You don't specialize in X, or all of your work doesn't look like, with like a certain thing. And we don't care about any of that. We care about the places where we work and responding to the places where we work, and solving problems and having fun doing it. And first and foremost, the biggest through line is this idea of urbanity that runs through every single project, even an air traffic control tower, and I'll explain what that means. But it's this idea of building community with our work. And so urbanity, and I'm going to be very quick on this. If you're interested in this, the book goes into this in much more detail. But I define urbanity in the book a certain way. It is not about size. A lot of people hear the word urban, they hear urbanity, they think I'm talking about really huge cities. That's not what I'm talking about at all. What I'm really talking about is this idea that different people, and I don't just mean racial difference, of course I mean that, but I mean racial difference, gender difference, cultural differences, economic differences, class, how you pray, how you think, that a really urban place, whether it's a small village or a big city, invites those collisions, invites this idea of celebrating difference. That's also why the book is called The Architecture of Urbanity and not The Architecture of Community. We use the word community a lot in architecture and urban planning. It's a good word, but it's also a tricky word. And I'd ask you to be a little suspicious of it because communities tend to be tribal, right? They tend to encourage people to hang out with other people who look like them, think like them, vote like them, pray like them. And we've already got a force in the world that does that. It's called social media, right? And that's what's pulling our world apart right now. And we don't even have to argue about this. Like, we know that these algorithms are designed to silo us and make us fight with each other. And so to me, the antidote to that is what we do as architects and urbanists, where we actually invite people into the same space with our differences so we can debate, we can look each other eyeball to eyeball and confront each other's humanity. Urbanity is also about climate change because it is about this sense of communal living. This is a diagram from an economist, Kate Rayworth, a book I'd really recommend, a short book called Donut Economics. But basically what Kate argues is that instead of looking for growth, that what we need to understand is that we should all be living inside of a donut. And what she means by that is that if you live in the hole in the donut, you've fallen into scarcity. You've fallen into precarity. You don't have the housing you need. You don't have the resources you need. You don't have the basic things you need to live your life. If you overshoot and you're outside of the donut, you're using more than you should be using. You're using more resources than you need, right? And so this whole idea of living inside of the donut, which I think is a really fascinating idea, to me ties to this idea of urbanity, of what kind of density is the density that might be appropriate for a given community. So it's with all of that background that we practice. And we're very serious about practice. Ours is not a foundation. Ours is not simply an urban planning firm. Right? We're an architecture firm and we build things in the world. We have to be licensed. We have to care about people's public safety and health. But we also have a point of view, and that point of view leads us to 4 practice areas, right? Which include social housing, cultural and institutional work, public infrastructure and urban planning, and workspaces of the future. At the center of all of that is, again, this idea of having a voice, this idea of thought leadership, and what surrounds all of it is the idea of co-design, that we're always working with end users, with communities to understand what should get designed in democratic circumstances, which is why we don't work in dictatorships and so forth. I do not understand the logic that says, I'm gonna go fly and work somewhere where they'll give me freedom. That is colonialist bullshit talking. That somehow says that, like, you wanna work someplace where no one gives you any constraints. You're not a sculptor, you're an architect, right? If you don't want constraints, go work in your garage, right? Architecture is about building in the world, and you're part of the world. And so there is responsibility that comes with that. You define that for yourself in terms of what that responsibility is. You don't have to accept my point of view, but I think having a point of view is critically important. So I'm gonna talk about these practice areas sort of one by one, starting with social housing. Housing is a national and international crisis. Anywhere I go, it is top of mind for people. Anywhere I go in the middle of this country, it's top of mind for people. No one can afford how they live anymore. This is really fascinating. Since 2019, really since the pandemic, the salary you need to own an average home in this country is almost doubled. So you need a 6-figure salary just to own a simple starter home, right? that is earth-shattering, right? And so if you wonder why our politics are as fragmented as they are, you know, it's really important to focus on this. And it's something that we have direct bearing on in terms of our profession. The problem I have with a lot of the housing conversation, though, is that it talks about housing as quantity, housing units, as if they're widgets. They're not. They're how people live, and they're how people live not just as individuals, but in community and in neighborhoods. And so for me, I like to go back to the basic building blocks. Something that we used to talk about a great deal in this profession, we don't use the term anymore so much, is this idea of housing as fabric, right? That it's a continuity of fabric, right? And that it builds community one by one, right? And you can see this. These are all different places all across the world: Philadelphia, Beijing, Brazil, Havana. It's really important, though, sorry, one other point. It's really important to understand that if you wonder why new development, for the most part, doesn't look like this, it's because none of this meets code. It's all illegal by today's codes. It doesn't meet fire code. It doesn't meet wheelchair code. It doesn't meet any number of other building codes that are there for very, very good reasons, but have made buildings bigger, taller, create all sorts of infrastructure issues. So, you know, when we did the TED Talk, actually, we did a major piece of research on this, and now you hear about this quite often. It's the fact that the International Building Code says that if you build a 3-story multifamily residence, you don't need an elevator, as long as the ground floor units are accessible to a wheelchair. Go above 3 stories, you hit a step function, you need an elevator, and what tends to happen is when you build 1 elevator, you need 2, then you build a corridor to support those elevators, then you need fire stairs, and suddenly you're not building a small-scale building anymore, you're building a much, much larger building. So to me, this 3-story thing is really fascinating. Some people refer to it as a single-stair module. And other people refer to this idea of the missing middle. So what does our market produce in the United States? It produces single-family homes, and it produces towers. And for the most part, it doesn't produce much in between, a little bit, but not much. And so that to me seems to be critical, because we went out and did, well, what TED asked us to do actually is say, is there any such thing as carbon negative housing? And we know you can actually make the house on the left operationally carbon negative. In most sunny climates, right? I'm not talking about embodied energy, which is the energy it took to make the house. I'm talking about operational energy, which is to live in the house, use the house, electricity, and so forth. But the problem is that's the suburbs. And even if you do that to that house, you still have a car, you have land degradation, you've got biodiversity problems, you've got any multitude of problems associated with that. The towers, we don't have a way to build carbon negative towers. If you see something online or on social media that says someone is building a carbon negative tower, they are lying to you. There is no technology to do that yet. There will be. There will be solar windows. There will be all sorts of things that are coming. There's bioconcrete coming that's low emission. All of that's happening, and it will happen. But that technology does not exist today. We were very interested in that middle ground. And what's interesting is that 3 stories, you just using solar panels and batteries, you can generate more electricity in most sunny climates than the inhabitants need. You can build graceful apartments, 1,000 square feet for an apartment, which is, at least by most city circumstances, quite generous. And you can have it all center and pinwheel around that central stair core, which means you build community, because everyone's using that same volume. But to me, it's not just, again, like I said, about the housing, but what can you build with the housing, right? And so the fact that you can take those 3-story modules, align them as courtyards, align them as street wall, and you can create fabric, you can create walkable communities with them, and you can house 330 residents in a way that is like a relatively efficient way to use land that still has greenery, right? And so you can see the impact of those. And so you can imagine integrating that as infill housing in an existing city. And you can also imagine it being regionally responsive. So it's not like a one-size-fits-all, but the idea that, in South Asia, you might build it out of brick, but in Queens, you might build it out of wood or light gauge steel. And you can imagine how you could build this around train stations and suburban areas all around the country, and you can make it transit oriented. And so that was a very important learning lesson for us. We're still trying to build that prototype in places. In the meanwhile, we're still out there in the world. And our biggest housing project actually is in East New York. It's near Kennedy Airport. It's one of the poorest parts of New York City. Our client is actually a pastor who owns an 11-acre site. I drew this sketch for him on my iPad 8 years ago. That's his church, the baseball diamond-shaped thing. It's about an acre. And he had this idea of creating a community heart, and that would, build a street wall of all affordable housing, ranging from housing for formerly homeless all the way out to workforce housing, that would extend the grid, and would create this small park in the center, and it would be a destination. And the pastor had read his Jane Jacobs, so he knew about, all of the things like mixed use and small blocks and mixing old and new. And so he insisted on a lot of different entries. Also, article of faith among planners, ground floor retail. There's not enough foot traffic here to support ground floor retail throughout an 11-acre site. So we have a grocery store, but the ground floor is activated actually by social infrastructure, by 24/7 daycare, by vocational center. And so that's the way we're actually doing that kind of urbanism. This went through the city's rezoning process. The local council member and the local community wanted brick. They wanted some home ownership units, which are those smaller units that you see on the left and the right. And they wanted this modulation of scale. This is very low budget. It's block and plank construction. But we're doing it. And the first phase is under construction. The pastor wanted a performing arts center. And so that's the foreground building amidst the background buildings of housing. That's a term some of you might not know. This idea that basically housing as fabric isn't meant to scream, I'm a big piece of capital A architecture. Maybe a performing arts center does that, maybe a public building, a community center, but that the housing is more just about the dignity of where people live. So we concentrated most of the budget actually on the entries to make people feel like, they have a place. And so like I said, that's under construction. But the problem is this, and if you've read about this abundance stuff, it's abundant, it's out in the air. Ezra Klein's new book about how, especially in progressive cities, we're doing a miserable job providing for people's needs, especially housing. So this is extraordinary. This project, it took us, from the time I did that sketch for the pastor, it took about 1.5 years to gain community trust, I would say. It's taking 9 years between that sketch and the first family living in the first affordable housing unit. And that is a problem of process, right? Where we have layered regulation and law upon regulation and law to slow things down, all in the spirit of trying to keep bad things from happening, which has basically prevented good things from happening and made it more and more expensive for our cities, and we've got to change it. And this is not a problem that's sitting in the White House right now. It's a problem that's sitting in our city halls and our city council chambers and our community boards, and we've got to fix it. That actually sponsored us to do one of the op-eds I talked about, that last one, this housing one, where the New York Times editorial board came to us and asked, how would you tackle the housing problem if you guys wanted to look at it? And we did this analysis. This was both planning and architecture. We looked all around the city, and we looked we found over 10,000 sites within a half mile of mass transit and outside of the flood zone that were either vacant lots or had a one-story building on them, all across New York City. Which, you take the train up to New York and you might like, oh my God, it's so full. It's not full at all. And we have this legacy transit system. We talk about adaptive reuse of buildings. We have to adaptively reuse our cities. I took the subway in Philadelphia a few weeks ago, and I was shocked by how few people were on it. And this is when we don't treasure enough the things that our predecessors gave us. to rebuild that subway today would be billions upon billions of dollars. New York has the only subway system in the world that has both local and express trains. Those express trains go sometimes at 60, 70 miles an hour underneath the city, can move you incredible distances. And so building upon that is so important for the environment, for the culture. And so we said, okay, we've identified 10,000 sites. We used our little missing middle because it's New York, so it shifts over to the left. It's the smallest scale you'd build in, right? Out to block and plank construction, out to full poured in place concrete construction. And we then deployed that in sites all over the city and actually found enough housing. We found sites for 520,000 housing units, which means over 1 million people. There's over 100,000 people sleeping on the streets in New York today. Over 40,000, I believe, are children. We did look, because there's always the don't build crowd. We did look at the, oh, we just can put it in old office buildings because we don't need those office buildings anymore. This is such a hoax. We looked at this, we said, we took a big Manhattan office building. Here's the problem. See that big central area in the middle? You can't put people there. It's too far from the core. The floor plates are too deep, right? And so you can put some workspace there, but it's incredibly expensive to do this. It makes no financial sense. In a lot of ways, it makes more sense to tear the building down and build housing fresh, right? We have to build housing, folks. And we have to figure out how to do it in conjunction with communities, in conjunction with our laws, but do it in a way that's much more expedient than the way we're doing it right now. And so this is the tally of the housing we found. And what was interesting is that mid-rise was the workhorse. That was 300,000, 336,000 of the 520,000 housing units we found. Okay, so that's housing. And then just moving on to workspace, because it's tied at the hip, right? How does workspace work with housing? How do people get to work? We've had the pleasure for, well, actually, I worked on the master plan at SHOP and then this building while at POW, really since the beginning of the firm. So this is the Brooklyn waterfront. This is an old sugar refinery. It's an old landmark building. So you can't change a landmark building very much. You have to go through Landmarks Commission, which is a great commission in New York. You know, as I said, I'd worked on the master plan when I was at SHOP. A great landscape architecture firm, Field Operations, did this park. This park is amazingly, amazingly successful. This was all built by a private developer. Built our master plan, made it incredibly open and inviting to the public and the neighborhoods around it. I will tell you that the people, like the playground there, the kids who play in that park come from every walk of life you can imagine. And I think it's super important when I look at like all of the unrest we have today about the Middle East and the amount of campus protesting going on. I see kids from, again, like every racial group you can imagine, every religious group you can imagine playing in this playground. And I think that is so important because we have to see each other's humanity. I think these kids will see each other's humanity when they grow up and will not kind of be as polarized and as one-dimensional as we tend to be in our politics as we think about the other. And so to me, this park is a great Olmstedian social condenser. It's also just a really good park. This building sits in the middle of it. It was built to refine sugar. It was built in 3 phases. None of the windows line up. So when the developer called me in 2016, he said, how would you tackle this? Because the building is not even a building. It was built as a shell for sugar refining equipment. And so, you know, there are no floor plates. And as he was talking, I drew this drawing, which is basically to say, I think because it's a landmark, you can't make the windows wider, you know, you have to strike even floors across. I think what you've got to do is build basically a building inside the building and build a gap between the two in order to get light and air in and make the foundations make sense. And we went to our Landmarks Commission. Now, I just said something about government, how long it takes. The rezoning process for the housing project I talked about took 9 months. Going through landmarks with this building took about 9 years. Going through landmarks on this project took about 3 months. Landmarks was incredible, right? And we had this dialogue with them about architecture and said, listen, this is what the building was. Those windows were alive. There was no floors associated with the windows. There were steel tiebacks holding up these ring beams that were holding up the facade and these huge vats of sugar refining equipment. And so what we wanted to do was emulate the historic condition by placing that new building in with a new set of steel tiebacks and a new set of ring beams that held up the historic facade. And they approved us. And they even approved an overbuild, because what happened is when you did the gap, it pushed development rights up, and then that up had to have a shape. I kept drawing this barrel vault like the guy in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, you know, it was sort of obsessive, and it comes from the fact that these buildings, these old buildings from the 1880s, they were built in something called the American round arch style. That wasn't just a decorative thing. Those brick arch windows are there because the older buildings were brick and they had a wooden lintel holding up the brick above the window. When there was a fire, and there was always a fire in these factory buildings, the wood lintels would catch fire, the entire building would collapse. So by developing a brick arch, they would develop factory buildings that were basically fire retardant. And I thought that was kind of incredible as I read that history, and so we went to the arch. The arch is also a perfect form for this. It makes column-free space. The foundations land in the right place. It's very, very strong. It's curved glass at the top that's fritted and shaded for the event space that's up at the top. We did all of this fun detailing. And I include these because if you're interested in, like, you're an architect, but you're very socially minded and you're very interested in social issues, there is no get out of jail free card in terms of understanding this. It takes years. It takes years. And you have, if you're gonna be an architect, I would encourage you to be an architect. Get licensed. You can't call yourself an architect unless you're licensed, sorry. And you have to learn all this because it's, again, what we do. We protect life and human safety, and this stuff has to be right, down to the fact that the brick and the glass move differentially. So we had to develop this knife blade for where the steel tie beam comes into the glass so that they could differentially move. And that is not a rendering. That is what is out there today. In that gap, our landscape architect came up with the idea of planting 23 pin oak trees in that vertical garden. It's spectacular. The brick acts as a thermal shield, and it protects the glass curtain wall from glare and heat gain. But the most important thing is that in a post-pandemic circumstance, you're inviting people to work in an incredibly unique space where they're in contact with nature, they're in contact with history, and they're in contact with modernity. This is meant to be a creative office space, and it's actually filling up with a lot of small creative tenants. And then the ground floor, we're always very focused on the ground floor. We do these drawings, we have fun doing these drawings, even though they take forever. This was about going to landmarks and saying we need to drop all the windows to door height because we want to make the building very porous to this beautiful park system that's all around it. And that is what is happening. So you see those are all dropped to door height. There's various entrances for retail and food and beverage. This is really beautiful park. This great new bakery, which is all local. This developer does not lease to any chain stores, which is really refreshing. That's what's going on at the top of the building in the mornings. There's events there at night. It's pretty spectacular. Also on Workspace, we've been working just down the block for years. So that's 30th Street Station on the right. This is for Brandywine, for a great gentleman named Jerry Sweeney, who hired us to do the master plan for those two buildings. So Kieran Timberlake, of course, did the Bulletin Building. West 8 did the park, the landscape architecture firm. We were tasked with designing these two buildings, an office building and then a mixed-use building right next to it. The red building, Inga Saffron gave us this great review. It was about a set of like kids blocks, and it's red because of Furness and the trains and things that you all know very well here in Philadelphia. And again, the ground floor, and we really wanted to, let's see if this works. It works. Oh, there it is. We really wanted to create, that's College Walk right there, create this catcher's mitt of public space at the end of College Walk, between the two buildings and underneath your High Line. And I think pieces of that are built right now. wanted to elevate the building to really invite the new park in and Kieran Timberlake's building. And so this is what happened. So phase one is built, and you've all seen phase one probably, and that's office and residential. It's very successful, but the problem is it was always meant to play kind of the quiet piece to the kind of, it's the salt to the pepper of the red building. And the red building still isn't built. So they'll make more sense when they're together, especially the red brick that's in the first phase building. But we really like this building, and it's really interesting that it's built and hopefully won't stand out there quite so lonely for too long. Okay, then moving up to the cultural and educational category. We're doing a big building on Princeton's campus. And again, this was about, so one of the things we like to say with all of our projects is regardless of the program, we're building a community center. Sort of regardless of the program. We're building something that helps to define community, define urbanity. And so with Princeton, this is a campus that cares very, very deeply about its grounds, about its landscape architecture. So this is a very big building in the heart of the campus. Again, another terrifying moment, because if you stand there, we won this commission, and there's a Robert Venturi building, which is that gray building to the lower left. And then Harry Cobb has a complex, Todd Williams and Billy Chen. Like, it's extraordinary, the roster of architects that Princeton's hired to build out its campus. What we wanted to do is use the mass of the building to lock into the buildings around it to create a new episodic series of courtyards that were then connected by portals. And so that's the sketch of our building in the middle, kind of like woven into the fabric of Princeton. It is a contemporary building, but it is using a material palette that's trying to echo the material palette of Princeton. And again, we think those are things that build community, build a sense that that building, that new building, belongs here and can't just be anywhere. So whereas there was an ethos that said, I want my building to really stick out because I want people to say, look, it's my building. Oh. Like, we're more interested in how does the building not be contextual exactly, because that also is a problematic word, but has a relationship to the place that it's in. So that's a scalar relationship, a material relationship, something that says we are pulling the past forward into the future. And this building, by the way, is donated by Melody Hobson, who's one of the most prominent African-American alumni of Princeton University. And there is something here about also getting people out of eating clubs and staying in a more communal residential college. So it's a very important part of a larger social agenda that Princeton has. And that is a timber building. It's geothermally heated and cooled, and that too is under construction. And then the other building in the cultural category is we won a competition to expand. We only really go for invited competitions, which this was. Open competitions tend to be very exploitative. There's one exception, which I'll show you in a second. Expanding IMP's building in Cleveland, terrifying in a different way to touch an IMP building. But we felt we had to engage the building. The building was designed for a different site. Pei moved it to this site. It was designed to look like a turntable from space. These did not lend themselves to a functional diagram for the building, and so it doesn't work very well. So the new building is about a new lobby, new performance space, new office space, new exhibition space. But we also wanted it to relate better to the city of Cleveland. There's a big grade change that the lobby has to do. And the community center thing, we wanted to really invite people in, be both reverent to the Pei building in terms of these shapes, but irreverent in terms of, let's rock and roll. And again, can't escape the details. That's how the two buildings meet. This also keeps me up at night, this gutter detail. It's terrifying, it's a Pei building. But the community center thing, we convinced our client that this lobby space, which is also an amphitheater and a performance space, a kind of impromptu performance space, should be unticketed. So it costs $20 to get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And you do that right through this door. But the issue here was, on a cold Cleveland day, could you come and just make music? There are tremendous educational programs that happen in this building. And we felt that that invitation of creating a free space that was weather protected on Lake Erie in Cleveland was really, really important. So that's also under construction. And then public infrastructure and planning. This is, in some ways, this is the last category, and I left it for last because the charrette topic, I hope the charrette topic kind of scares you a little bit, because it scares me. Big sites in cities should be scary. We should not look at that and say, oh, that's what I'd do with that. If you know what you're gonna do, God bless. But public infrastructure and planning is the most complicated work. It's political. It is very deeply engaged with communities. So I just want to show you a couple of master plans. This is a master plan we did for the city of New York, a 184-acre site over an open rail yard in Queens. It's the largest kind of site, if you will, in New York City. Extraordinary. The entire Northeast Corridor goes through here. So if you take an Amtrak from here to Boston, you're going through Sunnyside Yard. It's the Amtrak's biggest rail operations facility. That's what it looks like. It's absolutely gargantuan. You can see Midtown off in the distance, but Midtown's only about a 10-minute subway ride from here. Surrounded by very, very diverse communities, but gated off. A lot of development has happened on certain sides of the yard. And there were previous plans to just build towers wherever foundations could land between tracks. And I think we won this because I'm a big fan of our engineers, and I went to one of my favorite structural engineers on a Saturday morning, and I sent him this sketch, and I said, Eli, can we build mid-rise, and can we build some sort of a tabletop so we can distribute the foundation load between the tracks and the same points, but do that in a way that creates a kind of different scale, a kind of more human scale. And that is what we ended up designing over the course of a couple of years, is that over the track system. So there are taller buildings as you approach the subways and the taller buildings to the north, but then you get into that mid-scale as you approach the lower scale parts of Queens. There's a whole net zero agenda here I don't have time to go into. Drawings. This guy named, we have these people who do these beautiful drawings in our office. When you get out of school, you should never, if you draw beautifully, you should never just be assigned to draw beautifully. Right? You have to learn architecture. You can't just draw beautifully. And drawing beautifully doesn't guarantee anything about learning architecture. But it is really important because it's how we communicate with each other and the world. And so these kinds of images are really important when you're talking to communities. I'm a big fan of doing things like this. Snowy weather. It's not always sunny with kids with balloons and renderings. Like, it's the world, right? It's the world. But how it relates to subways, there's a big grade change that happens here. How does that work? How does it work for someone in a wheelchair? All of those questions your drawings start to indicate. Where might a new train station go? And should there be public space around that train station? What's really important about this isn't architecture yet. This is master planning, but you still have to make it look architectural. If I go to a community board meeting and I show these buildings as just boxes, I'll get thrown out of the room. You have to show some sense of intent with all of that. Another piece of infrastructure, very different scale, very different thing. The only open competition we've ever entered, we actually won. I'm still kind of peeling myself off the floor. This was a competition for the Federal Aviation Administration. Elon didn't kill the contract. There are 145 regional airports around the country that are in desperate need of new, small air traffic control towers. This is not for Philadelphia Airport. It's for very, very small airports around the country. It's called F4, which means form follows function with flair. And what we wanted to do is we really thought about the fact, okay, we're building in rural areas, and we're building probably the tallest thing in that town. And so our minds immediately went to, I've driven cross country 6 times. I love these things. Our minds went to rural water towers. There was an architect named Goodhue, that's the Lincoln, Nebraska State House, who really, Frank Lloyd Wright was all about the horizontality of the plane. Goodhue really believed in this idea of marking the plane. And then R2-D2, I'll explain in a second. What that's about is that our towers have to telescope like R2-D2 does. So it has to go from 60 feet to 120 feet, depending on the airport. And so it's a completely modular system. So we designed a prototype, and we're now designing 7 of these, and maybe more all around the country. We're taking them through construction documents. They're fascinating little buildings. Air traffic controllers are very, very intense people. And so it's been interesting getting to know their needs. This is about like how many inches more or less it is to go to the bathroom, because going to the bathroom is one of the most fraught things you can do as an air traffic control tower, as an air traffic controller. It's when that plane has only 1 controller as opposed to 2. So that time needs to be as small as possible. So architecture, kind of always matters with these things. And so this was done under Secretary Buttigieg. It had to be incredibly green. We're making them geothermal where we can. These have a 50-year life. They have to be fully maintained over their 50-year life. And then we have a whole deconstruction plan for what happens at the end of life for them. And so it's all engineering. This is an engineering-led thing. But it's still, it looks like Tatooine, right? I like that people know where Tatooine is. I'm almost done. So, yeah. Infrastructure. So I said we did this thing with Penn Station and the New York Times in 2016. How many of you have been through Penn Station? Most of you. Glorious place, isn't it? So some of you might have come through Moynihan Train Hall, the new Amtrak train hall. That was about $1.5 billion, very important train hall. But that serves Amtrak customers, which is about 5% of the 650,000 people who use Penn Station daily. It's also the wealthiest people who use Penn Station daily. Most of them are still stuck in this 11-foot hellhole that is incredibly dangerous and is one of the most This is the busiest transportation hub in the Western Hemisphere. It handles about 3 times the passengers a day than our busiest airport in the country, Atlanta Hartsfield, and all in very, very little space. And so there was a station, which I'll explain, big, beautiful station, torn down in the 1960s. Madison Square Garden was placed on top of it. There have been all these ideas about Madison Square Garden moving. Madison Square Garden's not going to move. But we did this op-ed in 2016 with the Times about if they moved, how you could recycle the shell of their building to turn it into a new train station without new foundations and a new roof and all that stuff. That's not going to happen. But this actually did trigger a real contract and a real job. My current client for Penn Station came to us because of that. We did a lot of history here. I won't go through all of this. When it was built in 1906, the train shed was the biggest construction project in North America, displaced a huge number of African-American families that were working on the West Side waterfront. And they built this to build a station for cross-country travelers who were quite wealthy. This is a McKinley White building. Alexander Cassatt from Philadelphia was the patron. Extraordinary building, built after the Baths of Caracola in Rome. That's the Baths of Caracola waiting room, very famous. It's extraordinary to me that this building really only had a 50-year life. It was a double block building. And it was torn down because what happened is Eisenhower passes the Federal Highway Act in '54. People start flying much more. Penn Central Railroad basically goes bankrupt. It gets taken over by the government, which ultimately becomes Amtrak. Penn Central decides to sell its real estate holdings, including this station. They keep the ownership of the station underground. They sell everything above ground to private development. What's fascinating to me is it took almost 7 years to tear down the old station. That's how big it was. Lou Kahn famously died in the old Penn Station. It's got all sorts of sort of legend and history associated with it. They never shut down the station. And this is a great photograph. This is from 1967. And you see the remaining edifice on 7th Avenue with Madison Square Garden going up in the background. That demolition triggered the nation's landmarks laws. We have landmarks laws in this country because of this event. And so that was built. And so now we have a new mission. So my client, a public-private partnership, has approached the government about cladding the cylinder of Madison Square Garden in a square, which builds out much more space, and then taking out their theater, which is that blue thing right there, and building a new train hall and a new concourse system underneath. Really interesting architectural challenge, a cylinder on top of a square. I don't know if you recognize this building, Asplund, from Stockholm, the public library. We obviously looked at Grand Central Station. We looked at the original Penn Station. We looked at the Farley building across the street, which is now Moynihan Station, which was based on Schinkel, and the Altus Museum. And I call our building the mirror of a ghost, because McKim designed both Farley, which is the middle building, and the original Penn Station to mirror each other. But that building is now a ghost, and we're talking about replacing it. And so these are just, so we put these into the Times. Before and afters are very effective representational tools. So this is the top of the post office, the Moynihan building. So this is current, proposed, where we reclad the whole thing in stone. We take out that theater and have this big central entrance. This is just how the stone reacts to light, the facade reacts to light, this big public room. And that would really change this entire neighborhood, which is kind of a terrible neighborhood right now. And so hope springs eternal about whether we get this done. And then I'm just gonna close with two small projects in Indiana, where I just came from. This is the opposite side of the spectrum from Penn Station. This is in Columbus, Indiana. Some of you may know Columbus as a big architectural pilgrimage site. This couple called the Millers were big architecture fans in this little town in Indiana. If you go there, and I really encourage you to go there, you will see some of the best work from some of the best 20th century architects in the world. Make sure you see the Miller House, which was designed by the younger Saarinen. At the end of their lives, they set up this endowment called the Miller Prize to invite new architects and landscape architects to build structures there. We got this call a couple of years ago that we had won the Miller Prize, and they asked us to help rejuvenate downtown in the aftermath of the pandemic, because there weren't workers coming there, retail was dying, they wanted something to help attract the town. So we went out and we did a huge amount of community engagement in the streets and schools, ice cream parlors, and we got the city engineer high on ice cream, actually, and got him to agree to take out the street lights in the main intersection in town and replace them with stop signs. And then we were able to use the foundations and power from those street lights to propose this pavilion, because it came out of all of this community engagement that people wanted a place to gather. And so the mayor in this little, very conservative town had a heart attack. She's like, can trucks drive under there? I'm like, yes, mayor, trucks can drive under there. We had to general contract this ourselves. We built it in about 5 weeks. And it's a tent structure. And in fact, during the process, the community said it was supposed to be a temporary pavilion that lasted 4 months, but they wanted it for longer, so it had to take snow load. And so we had to re-engineer it. And it sits out there. It's based on everything from the Pantheon to local wigwams to Indiana State Fair architecture. But the most important, it's a really simple piece of architecture. It's just basically a pavilion. But what it's done is extraordinary. It's invited all of these diverse members of this community to come and have events. And it encourages them to close that intersection on nights and weekends. And they have all sorts of parties there. And people do all sorts of interesting things there. And who knew in the middle of Mike Pence's Indiana there was this kind of diversity, but there is. And so it sits out there right now, and it's really kind of something else. And then I just returned from this opening. This is the last project I'm going to show you on the infrastructure front. And I wanted to show you this especially because for our site, it's not just the site, but it's how does it connect back to the city, right? So this is a bridge. We're invited to do this competition with a very good engineering firm called SBP in Indianapolis. Indigenous peoples had a very interesting relationship with this land and the water on the land. It's very, very lush. And the entire place is a river tributary to the Mississippi. We begin in water, we return to water. And this is downtown Indianapolis. You are in this photograph, you are maybe 10 minutes from the heart of skyscrapers and banks and Starbucks and everything else. And you're actually about 3 minutes away from the Purdue and Indiana University hospital complexes. And yet bald eagles fly here. It's part of the creek system. This is Fall Creek. It comes off of White River. But there's a very troubled history here. So that's the site. Downtown's to the lower right. The hospital district that I mentioned. And then Riverside, which is a predominantly African-American community, was redlined. And a lot of the people who live in Riverside work in the hospitals and did not have a direct connection, had to drive, and so they've been fighting for this bridge for a long, long time. The city set up this innovation district called 16 Tech. They went out and got foundation funding, and that's who hired us to design and build this bridge. An enormous community engagement process, again, over the pandemic, over Zoom, ensued to build this. And so that gives you a sense of what we were doing all through the pandemic days in terms of hearing people's thoughts. And we did something that was a complete first in Indianapolis history. We argued with City DOT to have less space associated for cars and more for people. There's a group called the Riverside Riders that wanted bike lanes and wanted pedestrian space. And so we were able to get more than 50% of the bridge to be dedicated to pedestrians. And then in terms of the design of the bridge, we wanted something that emulated the trees. We didn't want one of those big iconic white spears that sticks out into the sky, but something that sat quietly in the tree trunks and emulated the tree trunks in terms of their structure and form, and would just sit low. And one of the things that's really important is the top of the bridge is well below the canopy. And so it just opened. So I was just on it yesterday. There was a big party with the mayor and the Riverside Riders and a Daytona 500 car, an Indy 500 car. It was pretty funny. So you see the hospitals off to the left, Riverside community to the right, this whole trail system. The lighting is quite nice at night. It's very secure. People were concerned about that. One of the things is that both people who are visiting the hospitals, so visiting a loved one, can come here and have, some respite, but hospital workers that maybe are coming off a really tough shift can walk through this bridge. And you see that little, I had to really fight in the budget to get that little bell out there. So in the center of the bridge, you had a little bit more space, and the railing leans out a little bit, and that ability for people to really be in the creek. And so you see it kind of nestles in the trees, meant to be quite quiet, but also quite tectonic, the stereotomic base in terms of the concrete pier that it sits on. And so people just hang out there. It's really nice. We fought for a wood walkway that got value engineered, which was a shame. But so there's a lot of parties, which is great. And I'm just going to close with this because one of the things I'm very proud of is people like to party in our spaces. This is the playground and fountain in front of Domino and all the different kinds of folks that you see there. And then this is under the Interoculus in Columbus. And so I'm just going to close with this. Aldo van Eyck, one of my favorite architects from the 20th century, said, whatever space and time mean, place and occasion mean more. And what I think he meant by that is that it's not so much about the architecture. The architecture is super important, but what gives it meaning is how people use it, inhabit it, give it identity. So I'm going to close with that. Hopefully that's been helpful for you to see as you sort of toward this trajectory we've been on for the last 10 years. And I think we have some time for questions. Sir. All the work is personal. Yeah, can you repeat the question so it's maybe a little louder?
For example, I used to have a boss.
Or do you want me to repeat the question?
A R2D2 head design for a floor space in the YMCA. But that was something that just kind of meant something to him, but it helped him get more interested and inspired to create
Uh-huh.
rather than just treating it as what it was, which was just a YMCA space.
So I think the core of the question is kind of like, where does inspiration come from, maybe, and kind of. I think that's all very personal for everyone. But my comment about sculpture is that, like, for me, you use the word derivative, and I don't think of it as derivative. I think of it. So the reason R2D2 was relevant to the air traffic control tower wasn't a kind of random connection. It was about the fact that the air traffic control tower is a machine. It has to do this transformer thing, right? And so to me, there's something about that machine that equated to this thing that was in, my head. But I think, what does the Pantheon have to do with an intersection in Columbus, Indiana? We all bring different ideas to the table, but I think it's really incumbent upon us to test whether those ideas are relevant, right? I think part of the question is also, I don't think we just come up with stuff so much out of thin air. I don't think that's actually true of anyone. Even some of the crazy stuff you see built in the desert has, grounding in something, derivative in something. Because to me, the fundamental, I'm trying to make sure I answer your question the way I think I should. To me, the 20th century was fundamentally about tabula rasa, where you went in, you wiped the slate clean, and you built urban renewal, and you just built something that was your kind of vision and imposition. I think the 21st century is fundamentally different, where you are layering on environments in communities with people's narratives, with people's histories, adaptive reuse. And so you are pulling all these references forward. And my question is, can you do that in an interpretive way rather than a literal way, right? And that's certainly what we try to do. Okay, sure. Anyone else? Sure. How do I? The subaltern. Can you define subaltern? Yeah. So community engagement is, and I tried to make reference to this in the beginning. This is a tricky thing. We try to do a great deal of it. We believe in it. I think one of the things that's really changed, so there's a fair amount of data that says that community boards, right, are pretty loaded up with a lot of people who do not necessarily represent the community, because they're people who fundamentally have the time to participate, right? And so there's a lot of data that shows us that, community boards skew whiter than the demographics in their neighborhoods, skew wealthier than the demographics in their neighborhoods, and often, for instance, with housing, are very protective of their home equity and don't want new housing as a consequence. One of the things that I found that we just stumbled upon during the pandemic is that when community boards went to Zoom and all of this stuff suddenly became digital, a couple of things happened. People could participate who didn't necessarily have 2 hours and couldn't go to a community board meeting, but could tune in for 20 minutes from their kitchen if they were a single parent or whatever, and could manage that and could get their input in a more precise way. The other thing is we've used functions like the Zoom polling function, and that I think is really important because, again, I think the community engagement process often favors extroverts, right? People who are vocal, want to be vocal. And the polling thing allows someone to anonymously and quietly be able to submit ideas without having to, put their hand up on the Zoom screen. And I think that's also been really useful. The reason I say it's all tricky is, what do you do when the community tells you that they don't want people who look different than them in their neighborhood? And this is why I think, there has to be a balance, right? Between you're not doing all of this training to become note takers at community board meetings, right? You should be good note takers at community board meetings, but that is not the beginning and end of what you do. And the judgment, is a very tricky thing about what to listen to and what you think you shouldn't listen to, right? So take this car thing, right? People are car crazy in this country. It is insane. For someone who writes books about cities and wanting walkable neighborhoods, I leave Manhattan, just don't even think about leaving New York City, just leaving Manhattan and you're immediately in, yeah, I want my car, right? And if I'm told I've got to listen to that because that's what the community wants, that's a really problematic thing for the environment. It's a really problematic thing for a lot of people. And so you've got to start bringing professional judgment to that. And so that's why expertise and subject matter expertise and things you learn in school and how you learn to critically think about things still matters. And so finding that balance, I can't stand here and tell you what the right balance is. You have to make that determination for yourself, but I urge you to think about the balance. Yeah. Sir.
Hi, I just say thank you so much for your time.
Sure.
So I have a couple of questions, but I'll ask just one to start. So with the projects you've shown today, there's a lot of very interesting formal moves that are being made, and I'm a big fan personally of taking classical or vernacular forms and kind of bringing them into modern technologies and ideas. So I just wanted to ask if there was any more information or research that you'd like to share on how things like, for example, Sean's Sugar Factory came about, or playing around with things like Rock and Roll Hall of Fame Museum and its kind of very unique form, which I can play into.
Great question. I love that you're interested in this. It's a deep passion of mine. If you're interested in this, I would encourage you to continue to read, I'm going to use this terrible word in academia, but since I'm not in academia, I'm going to use it anyway, the canon. And what I mean by that is there's all sorts of literature that I'm worried that people aren't exposed to in school anymore because somehow that stuff isn't of this day. Colin Rowe, Mathematics of the Ideal Villa. Gottfried Semper was absolutely critical in terms of the formulation for domino. Historians, theorists that go back 200 years, and yeah, most of them are old white guys, but the ideas still matter. And, this is just, you're hearing some frustration in my voice because this came up in our studio just 2 days ago. I mentioned, we were working on this Penn Station thing. We're doing some design revisions. I mentioned Colin Rowe and phenomenal transparency, right? I see Elia up there. Have you read Colin Rowe? He used to work for me. But he found greener pastures here in Philadelphia. You haven't either? So, no, you have. Okay, so in our studio, I found that most of the younger people hadn't read this book and most of the older people had. And I was utterly shocked because the people who work for us are incredibly intellectually curious. And they've gone to a wide variety of schools. And what I realized is it's not their fault. They're not being taught this stuff anymore, right? And I just, my dad was a scientist. And the way science works is, someone invents something And then you build on that invention. You build on the thought process. And knowledge is a tree, right? It's got a trunk, and there are branches, and the branches go out in other places, and they form new trees. And that's the way knowledge works. But we seem to have decided, nah, it's not a tree. We're just going to make it up ourselves. We're going to make up new words. We're going to make up new ideas. And we're not going to think about anything anyone ever thought about or progressed on an idea. That's nuts. That is absolutely nuts, right? And so, you know, are you in the charrette? So I can give you more books to read. You may regret having asked me this question, especially in public. But I'm happy to give you more books to read, and it's a great topic, and I'm really glad you're interested, and I'm sorry I took out my frustrations on your question. It's a great question. You said you had more, but I think we should give other people... Okay. You tell me. You know, I don't think any technology, but in and of itself, well, there's maybe a couple, but I think most technologies don't inherently help or harm. I think it's all about how we use them, right? I think there's a lot of promise in modular housing. I'm not a big fan of this idea that we're going to build modular like Lego blocks, because if you think about it, what you're really doing is you're shipping a bunch of air, right? I do think there's a lot of possibility in prefabricated flat pack, where, especially with timber construction, where we can build timber walls, timber floor slabs, and you know, bring them to more urban construction sites, have construction go more quickly, more safely, less disruptively. And so I think it depends on what you mean by modular, right? Changing the way in which buildings are made is a very difficult thing for lots of reasons. It's incredibly complex, right? There's workers who have workers' rights who are very, very concerned about protecting those rights and don't want things turned over to robots. And so, you know, it's a very complex topic. But I would encourage you to, I don't think it's an either or, I think it's a how. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much, Vishaan.
Thank you very much.